Hey, you know who else hangs out at Legal AF? Experts in the field of the presidency, constitutional law, abuse of power, and the First Amendment and freedom of the press. In fact, we have an amazing group of in-house experts in Sidney Blumenthal and Sean Wilentz, putting everything in historical context that we're watching with the abuse of power of Donald Trump. And they just put together and hosted a panel. Listen to this group of, this is the A team. This is the A team of anybody. If you wanted to have a dinner on a desert island with a group of fascinating people to talk about Donald Trump, abuse of power, and things like, I can't think of a better group hosted by Sidney Blumenthal and Sean Wilentz on Legal AF than this group. Listen to the panelists here that are coming up next. Deborah Pearlstein, the director of the program in law and public policy at Princeton University. She's an expert on the U.S. Constitution, on international law, democracy, and national security. But that's not all. She's joined by Suzanne Nossel, who's the former CEO of PEN America, a human rights advocate, and the author of Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All, along with, now that would be enough, but then they're joined by Richard Painter, who's the Walter Richey Professor of Corporate Law at the University of Minnesota, and he was the chief ethics lawyer for the George W. Bush administration. Joined, of course, with Sidney and Sean, a fascinating discussion you can't find anywhere and you don't want to miss, to talk about this Trump administration's assault on the rule of law, freedom of speech, and the new oligarchy that's happening right before our very eyes, unless we talk about it and break it down the way that this panel can. And here's the discussion.
Welcome to the Court of History. This is a nonprofit group that I began with Sean Wilentz, my partner here, a professor of history at Princeton University, who is the author of The Rise of American Democracy, a book that ends with the ending of the Civil War, but could not be more relevant to today. As Sean is also the author of a brilliant book about Bob Dylan's America, which I also commend to you. His writings have appeared far and wide, from the New York Times to the New York Review of Books to Rolling Stone, on all sorts of subjects, but particularly the subjects that our group is now focused on. We began this group dealing with the cornerstone of ideology of conservative jurisprudence, originalism and textualism, which is based on a distorted, falsified, and bogus history. And we have sought to expose and debunk it. We have moved on since the election, as those of you who have participated or attended our previous seminars and webinars are aware, to deal with the ongoing constitutional crisis. We have a distinguished panel here dealing with the rule of law, the attack on intellectual life itself, freedom of speech, and the integrity and ethics of government. And we look forward to each of them. But first, I would just like to let Sean say a couple words here.
Yes, thank you. And I'm going to say very little, just to say welcome to everyone, all of you who've been on the webinars before, all the newcomers. It's great to have you here. Just being together actually means a great deal, to be able to talk about these things in a reasonable way. Scary, but reasonable. Sidney, I say a few words about my friend Sidney Blumenthal, who, sort of needs no introduction, but I'll give one anyway. I mean, we're old friends from old New Republic days, but before that, he already established himself as a keen observer, particularly of right-wing Republicans and their institution building in his book, The Rise of the Counter-Establishment, and on and on and on thereafter. But now we finally made him into an historian, so he's been writing about Abraham Lincoln of late, and with a projected 5-volume political biography of Lincoln. So our interests intersect at the crossroads of history and politics, and with journalism kind of as the third road in all of that. And we're trying to find a way through these webinars, but many other means, to actually bring to as many people as we can conversations, discussions, a framework for understanding what's going on these days, because things are happening so quickly and it just seems to be out of control. So that's what we're here to do. I can't wait to hear everyone this afternoon, and I'll turn it back to you, Sidney.
Thank you. The recent events just in the last day or so have reminded me of some of my own experiences, and I'll speak about that very briefly before I go first to Deborah Pearlstein. There's so many enormities that take place, and they come so rapidly. Yesterday, there were Trump's executive orders, which he substitutes as if it's his constitution, against two individuals who he calls traitors. Chris Krebs, who was the head of cybersecurity in his first administration, and Miles Taylor, who was chief of staff for Homeland Security in his first administration, for criticizing him. There was also an executive order that came down to the Department of Justice attorneys. One of them lives around the corner from me, and pointed it out to me for urging them not to have anything to do with the American Bar Association. So we're going to discuss today the general assault on the rule of law, subordination of the law firms, banning of books, destruction of the National Endowment for Humanities, the overall attack on civil society, the subversion of ethics and integrity in government, just a few aspects of the overall attack on American constitutional democracy. And the overarching idea here is freedom from fear, which we all know comes from Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Four Freedoms, and for which he posited the United States was fighting in World War II. And that reminds me a bit, and I'll speak very briefly about it, of my first trip to Berlin 39 years ago. I was a reporter for the Washington Post. One of the first things I saw there in Berlin in 1986, off Unter den Linden, across from Humboldt University, was a memorial in the center of the plaza of something called the Empty Library. And it is a space in the ground that you have to look down into of empty bookshelves. It's the spot on May 10th, 1933, when students of the National Socialist Student Union, to the musical accompaniment of an SS choir, burned 10,000 books, as Joseph Goebbels proclaimed the end of the intellectual garbage of the past. And I'm reminded of it on a day when the National Endowment for the Humanities is trashed. On that trip to Berlin, by the way, my friend, the late Norman Birnbaum, a sociologist who was spending a year there, had been banned from East Berlin. The wall was still up. He had been talking to dissidents. He asked me if I would go over to the East and see his friends. I went over there at night. I had a long conversation with them. There was no freedom of speech, to say the least. They were desperate to see American movies. These people wound up being the leaders of Neues Forum that overthrew the East German regime in the end. On my way back through the Friedrichstrasse crossing, I was stopped. I was followed by the Stasi on my way back. Clearly, these people were monitored. And I was put in a cell inside the Berlin Wall for about an hour. A memorable experience, and my notebooks were stolen by the Stasi, and so here we are. I will say one thing about the East German regime, where there were no civil liberties or freedom to speak of, which was that they had a respect for science. So I'd like to introduce first Deborah Pearlstein, the director of the program in Law and Public Policy and a professor in Law and Public Affairs at Princeton University. She's an expert on the U.S. Constitution, international law, democracy, and national security. Deborah, please.
Huge thanks to Sidney for reaching out, and for my Princeton colleague, Sean Wilentz, for inviting me to join this conversation. I'm delighted and honored to be a part of it. I guess I want to pick up first just in these brief opening thoughts where you left off a little bit in your introduction, which is some initial thoughts from the 30,000 foot level. Obviously, my area, my field is law and constitutional law in particular. And so I followed in, recent months, and before that, but certainly in recent months, most closely the attacks on legal institutions that include not just commercial law firms, of course, but individual lawyers. And as you mentioned in the introduction, bar associations, including the American Bar Association, increasingly law schools, Georgetown Law School among them, and of course, a growing number of threats against judges and courts and calls, including by the president himself, for the impeachment of judges with whom he disagrees. I view all of these attacks on sort of law and lawyers and legal institutions as of a piece. And they're of a piece with what I've studied for my entire academic career, and even when I was a practicing lawyer, which are constraints on executive power. And if you think about not just from a formal constitutional matter, but from a broader perspective of constitutional democracy, in a more broadly defined sense, what the constraints are on the power of the American executive, or indeed any executive. Traditionally, of course, they're the Madisonian branches, Congress and the courts, and those, have been essential over time. But also the free press and universities and the media and the professions, and all of these institutions together. And I think it's important to see the attacks on law and lawyers and the courts as of a piece with what's going on now, which is attacks on all of these institutions. What they share in common is not just, in the case of Congress and the courts, and to some extent the free press, constitutional grounding, but they are part of a set of institutional knowledge structures that have been throughout U.S. history essential in holding claims to power, government and otherwise, in check. So that's the sort of broad framework I come from. The definition of constitutional democracy, in my view, is one that is not just limited to a government that has regular, free and fair elections, but also has the institutions that make those possible. The free part, the fair part, those require all of those institutions' involvement. So given that very broad perspective, let me focus here, I think, primarily just on the courts and lawyers in particular, because I think those are best seen as an attack, not just on the president's enemies, which they are and have been, but an attack on the rule of law itself. And when I say rule of law, I don't mean the rules or even the constitutional rules. I mean a concept, right? That it is a rule of law system in which the rules, the formal rules, are publicly known, they're made in advance, they're applied according to their terms and not according to the whims or personal preferences of any individual. The goal here, as I've written about publicly recently and in different academic settings over the years, that I think we're seeing play out and that I think is most concerning, is an effort by the president and the administration and its various components to try to challenge that idea, to try to make the rules, including the rules of contract, whether they're government grants to universities, or rules of due process that apply in the courts, or the freedom of speech and the right to counsel that are protected by the Constitution that are now under assault in these attacks on law firms. The goal is to instead make all of these rules negotiable. The president can threaten the law firm's right to speak, but if the law firms are willing to negotiate and surrender those rights, the president too is willing to make a deal. That's the opposite of a system of the rule of law, in which we all have certain rights and pillars on which we can rely. And instead, that's the rule by a single person who has whims and personal preferences and grievances. And that's the opposite of the rule of law system that we have long been able to rely on in critical ways. So what are we seeing? And we can talk about the details as much as you want. And I want to, take some time here and hope we'll have more of a dialogue as we go forward. So what we've seen in recent weeks, especially beginning, about 3 weeks ago, are a series of what the president has called executive orders that have targeted specific law firms, principally law firms who have represented, usually several years ago, people or causes that the president personally opposes. So law firms whose lawyers have represented Democratic causes or Democratic officials, law firms whose lawyers have previously in different jobs worked as prosecuting officials in cases involving the president. And it has threatened these law firms with loss of access to government buildings, with denial of access to government contracts, stripping them of security clearances. And especially for the firms that do a lot of business in government contracts, these are potentially business-ending threats. And what we've seen now is a real divide in the legal community. Some firms, Perkins Coie, Williams & Connolly, and several others, Jenner and Block, really pushing back hard, suing in the courts about the illegality of these orders and consistently winning. There have been 3 lawsuits filed by 3 separate firms. 3 separate judges have now enjoined them from operating as unconstitutional. And other law firms that are capitulating on the grounds or striking a deal with the president on the grounds that they think it is best for themselves, their business, and for their clients that they strike these deals. That's playing in, I think, to the system of the deconstruction of constraints that the president is interested in creating. I think it's enormously harmful to the rule of law system that we all have long relied on. And I'm happy to talk about sort of more in details, but maybe I'll stop there by way of introduction.
Thank you, Deborah. It's all very disturbing and part of an even larger process of an attack on the rule of law that also involves an attack on ethics. And that brings us to Richard Painter, who we're very fortunate to have with us today. He is the professor of corporate law at the University of Minnesota, and he served as the chief ethics lawyer for the George W. Bush administration. He has a recent piece in the Washington Monthly on the conflicts of interest involving the tech oligarchs who are, on the one hand, media lords, and on the other hand, government contractors. And this is part of a larger problem of ethics that Professor Painter now will address.
Thank you very much, Sidney, and I'm pleased to be here with such a distinguished group. And this is a very troubling situation we have for the country right now. And I want to emphasize that this really is a departure from the intent of the framers with respect to presidential power, abuse of presidential power, and with a president who's not accountable. I'm addressing these issues in a co-authored book with Tom Sullivan, the former president of the University of Vermont, that's coming out with Cambridge University Press later on this year. And one of the things we found looking at the original historical documents is the founders really did not want a president with this type of power. They never would have sold the Constitution to the states in the ratification process if a president were to be unrestrained. And you see in the Federalist Papers, if you really read the Federalist Papers carefully, that there's a message that the president would be accountable under the law. And that includes, quite frankly, being criminally accountable under the law. The Supreme Court's decision in Trump versus the United States in 2024 was just flat out wrong. I submitted an amicus brief in that case on behalf of former military leaders, and at least 3 of the justices may have read it. But it's really wrong. The idea that a president could commit a crime in office and not be prosecuted merely because he says that he is committing that crime in his official capacity. There's no support for that in the Constitution. And another proposition there's no support for is the idea that a sitting president can't be investigated and indicted while in office. I know that the Justice Department has taken the contrary view since 1973 under Richard Nixon, but that also, the historical evidence does not support that a claim that presidential power extends so far that a president is immune from criminal prosecution, from accountability under the law. And in many, many areas, we've seen a growth of presidential power over many decades. It's not a Donald Trump problem. It's over many decades. It's just coming to a head under Donald Trump, who wants to go and take presidential power to the next level, or several levels more than any of his predecessors even sought to exploit. I do have to go back to the torture memos under President Bush, which were not disclosed, of course, to the White House ethics lawyer. They were carefully classified and kept from me, and I read about it in the New York Times. But there, John Yoo makes the argument that the president's power under Article 2 of the Constitution preempts any criminal statute, including the criminal statute prohibiting torture, the treaties of the United States, the Convention Against Torture. Never mind that the Supremacy Clause of the United States Constitution says that the Constitution, the laws, and the treaties of the United States are the supreme law of the land, not according to the Office of Legal Counsel. Under John Yoo, when he was there in the Bush administration, he went back out to Berkeley to his tenured post at the law school out there, but he comes back in 2020 with a book called Defender in Chief that argues that President Trump, his use of executive power is absolutely critical to defend our nation, his unrestrained, unlimited use of executive power. I could go on and on about the abuses of presidential power that we now are potentially confronting. One issue is whether the President of the United States can ignore an order of the U.S. Supreme Court. The argument has been made, it was unfortunately made by some very liberal law professors just 2 years ago, that yes, he can, and that Abraham Lincoln did it. Actually, Abraham Lincoln did not violate an order of the U.S. Supreme Court. He violated an order of a federal district judge, Chief Justice Taney, sitting by designation in Maryland, who refused to allow Lincoln to suspend habeas corpus without consent of Congress. Well, the problem is Congress, I think, had a little trouble getting to Washington because people were blowing up the railroads up there in Maryland. And so maybe they had to arrest some people. Now, we could argue whether Lincoln did the right thing or not, but it's just fake news that Lincoln violated an order of the U.S. Supreme Court. Yes, maybe Andrew Jackson did and let some Georgia militiamen go and murder some Native Americans, but I'm not sure that's exactly the precedent that we want to establish today, although I noticed that Andrew Jackson's portrait is back in the Oval Office since this past January. My concern with respect to the media goes back once again to the intent of the framers that there be an independent media. Freedom of the press is expressly acknowledged in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. But freedom of the press only means so much if the president and persons close to the president control the major media outlets. And the question is, can press barons accumulate so much power and then being close to the president or running for president themselves that you have a conflation of the media, which is supposed to be independent of the government, and the government itself? You just watched the Orson Welles movie, Citizen Kane, about William Randolph Hearst, who wanted to, of course, become president, uses control of the newspapers to become president. You could see where this could go in the threat to American democracy. Fortunately, Hearst did not become president. Neither did Henry Ford, who had some even more troubling newspapers. But now, look at where we are now. Many younger Americans under the age of 30 rely on social media for their news. They're not watching cable news. They're not reading the New York Times or the Washington Post or Foreign Affairs, looking at TikTok or X or Truth Social, all the social media platforms. So the question is, who has control of social media? Well, the President of the United States himself has a social media platform where he is now giving investment advice. I spent a good part of the afternoon giving some interviews on radio, television about the ethics of the President of the United States giving investment advice while he's tanking the stock market. And of course, by willing to back off on tariffs, maybe having one good day in the market yesterday. But putting that aside, he controls Truth Social, which, by the way, he signed his post yesterday to buy stocks DJT, which is a ticker symbol for Truth Social, which skyrockets in price yesterday. I haven't looked at how it did today. But the president controls Truth Social. You got Elon Musk has X. And then there is Facebook and Threads and all the entities controlled by Mark Zuckerberg. Zuckerberg has had a complicated relationship with the president. In 2019, they had a meeting in the White House, apparently a dinner or something, where they talked about the possibility that Zuckerberg would have Facebook stop censoring Donald Trump's followers in return for regulatory concessions. And those concessions may have involved Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act and immunity from defamation, libel lawsuits for the high-tech companies, or it could involve something else. But this is a kind of quid pro quo. Regulatory concessions on the one hand in return for Facebook screening off or facilitating, enabling the president's supporters on his platform. This type of quid pro quo, it really does meet the constitutional definition of bribery. It doesn't meet the definition in the criminal statutes, but certainly the constitutional definition of bribery would be met by this, and that's the point I made in a recent law review article. Zuckerberg went along with that, and we got the January 6th insurrection. Zuckerberg then gets scared and starts cooperating with the Congress and with the Biden administration. The Biden administration makes the very ill-advised decision to start pressuring social media companies on content. I understand the Biden administration's concern about that, but the idea of the White House pressuring social media companies is exactly that's the type of precedent we don't want, and that right now is almost certainly being abused. And Zuckerberg, then Trump threatens to throw Zuckerberg in jail. As it becomes clear that Trump might win the election, Zuckerberg starts warming up to him last summer. And of course, as soon as he wins, guess who's back at Mar-a-Lago looking for a meeting with the president-elect is Mark Zuckerberg. And so now apparently we have the social media titans, Zuckerberg and Musk, in the back pocket of the president. The president, of course, gets to decide who gets to buy TikTok. He delayed the sale to make sure that he could control who gets TikTok. I don't know who's going to get TikTok, but it's not going to be George Soros. I can assure you that. And then there's the question of Jeff Bezos, who controls the Washington Post, which is one of the remaining influential conventional newspapers, of course, with a very, very good website and so forth. Well, the Washington Post, we remember, of course, I was a child at the time, but when the Washington Post blew the whistle on what was going on with Watergate and Nixon and Deep Throat, who was talking with Woodward and Princeton in the parking garage. I forget which one of them it was, but they literally brought down the president of the United States. That's when Katharine Graham owned the Washington Post. Well, it's a whole different deal under Jeff Bezos. They were really set to endorse Kamala Harris in the election, and then Jeff Bezos pulled that. He spiked that out there. And now, where are we? Where Jeff Bezos not only controls the Post, but a whole bunch of companies that have defense contracts with the Department of Defense very, very large contracts worth billions of dollars, particularly for space exploration, as does Musk with SpaceX. So you have the media moguls who have large government contracts that are going to be expanded upon orders of the President of the United States, who will control the platforms in which news is disseminated, whether it's conventional news in the Washington Post or the social media platforms. And this is very troubling from an ethics perspective. One of them, of course, Musk is inside the government. I testified in front of the U.S. House Natural Resources Committee this past February, a couple of weeks ago, about his conflicts of interest with SpaceX. The Republicans on the committee really want to get into space mining. They're going to go up to these asteroids and get valuable minerals and bring them back. SpaceX, of course, will make a lot of money out of this. And my simple point was that he at least should recuse from government matters that have an effect on his financial interest. But I'm not sure he's going to do that. He's required to under criminal statute. Oh, but we don't get to see his financial report. Well, why don't we get to see his financial report? Why isn't it public like all the other top officials? Oh, because he's only a part-time special government employee. Now, if you believe he's part-time, I can sell you the Brooklyn Bridge too. I mean, he's not part-time at all. He's restructuring the entire U.S. government. He has more power than just about anyone in the White House. He really should be confirmed by the Senate under the Appointments Clause to be doing what he's doing. And we can't even get his financial disclosure report to know what he has a financial interest in. What we do know doesn't look too good. I mean, if he's getting involved with NASA and SpaceX, or he's going after the CFPB, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, while he's, of course, giving out car loans through Tesla, and he wants to put a payments platform on X, it sounds like he's already violating the statute. But we'll see where it goes from here. But this is a consolidation of power between the president and his close friends who are billionaires. This is the way oligarchy works. And if you keep going in this direction, you end up with a situation like what they have in Russia, where you have the oligarchs close to Vladimir Putin, and they get richer and the others go to Siberia. I guess my dog here is weighing in as to his opinion of the state of affairs in Washington.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'd like to introduce Suzanne Nossel, who is the former CEO of PEN America. She is a human rights advocate, the author of Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. Suzanne.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I'll just add a few things to the picture from kind of the intellectual and cultural standpoint. There's been a lot of attention over the last week to the banning of about 400 books at the Naval Academy. And that forms part of a pattern that's been going on for years at the community level and the state level across the country, with thousands of books being banned. This is not about parents opening up a backpack at home and finding something that's inappropriate for their third grader. It's an organized, systematic campaign by groups that style themselves as parents' rights advocates, but have been part of the campaign to delegitimize discussions of race and gender in schools and in society. So this is, in a sense, kind of a harbinger of so much of what we're seeing now at the federal level. And those book bans have been contested. Book bans are not popular with most Americans. There are a whole series, a slew of lawsuits that are wending their way through the states, and its head for the first time at the college level, at the Naval Academy, and they're saying it's in compliance with the president's EO, banning DEI, banning gender ideology. So they've taken everything from Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings to works of history that spotlight contributions of Black Americans. There seems to be no rhyme or reason in terms of the ideological orientation of the book. It looks like it's blunderbuss. For the most part, at the state level, these books were on lists that were handed on down from community to community, right down to the typos in the names of the authors. And so I think it's safe to assume nobody's carefully scrutinized this list and the content of the books in question to determine whether there's any basis to ask that they be taken off the shelves at a university. A second kind of plank of this that I'll mention is affecting the National Endowment for the Humanities, which gives out about $225 million a year. Much of it goes to state humanities councils in all 50 states that use it to fund activities in museums and communities, things like book festivals, literary events, museum exhibitions. And there are articles, if you look right now in Iowa, in West Virginia, in South and North Dakota, all across the country, about how these state humanities councils are having the rug ripped out from under them. For most of them, it's the majority of their budget. So all of that activity, even though it was approved in the budget that was adopted earlier this year, has just been summarily halted. And there probably will be legal challenges to that, but there are really very few alternatives for this kind of funding. In our country, we have much less government funding for the arts and humanities than is the case in Europe and most other kind of Western countries, places like Canada and Australia. And so the idea that private philanthropy is going to come in to keep these institutions alive, I think is just not something that we can count on. Another plank of this effort is the expunging of content from government websites. And it was a high profile controversy over DOD's website when they took out pages devoted to the Tuskegee Airmen and other aspects of Black history. But it's happening across the whole network of government websites, and important information, history, data is just being pulled back. And the government argued in one of their cases that this would cause no harm to the citizenry because people could go on the Wayback Machine and dig up, this missing information if they were sophisticated enough to know what that was. Another institution, very low profile, but that actually gives out more funding each year than the National Endowment for the Humanities, is the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which, as you'd expect, supports museums and libraries all across the country. And that has been completely defunded. All of their staff and employees have been put on leave. And, if past is prologue and what we've seen with USAID and other institutions, if that pattern's followed, this body will simply cease to exist. At the National Endowment for the Arts, there hasn't yet been a full funding cutoff. There was a order that no grant monies could go to projects and programs involving gender ideology or DEI. And, if you know anything about kind of contemporary theater, it's sort of, all about themes that are very hard to separate from those ideas. There's a lawsuit filed in Rhode Island, and in response to that, for now, the NEA has pulled back on that directive. They're supposed to reissue it at the end of this month, and so we don't know yet where that stands. And then, finally, I'll mention the Smithsonian, where there's been a new executive order on restoring the truth in American history, promoting American greatness, and the Smithsonian's been accused of promoting divisive ideologies. They're going after the slavery section in the Museum of African American History, and how you can have a Museum of African American History that doesn't include a robust slavery section. I don't know, but the president of that museum has just stepped down, and so that's the next target. And, there's going to be more of this to come. AEI's just put out a report arguing for the wholesale elimination of the National Endowment for the Arts. And, that's how these ideas percolate. They get them from the think tanks. And then, in short order, there's an EO in front of the president and he signs it and the deed is done. And so, for me, this is, what I see is just a very profound effort. It's typical of all authoritarian societies to control how history is understood and discussed, and to cast a broad chill on, what writers write about, what musicians play, what theater performances go up, because people realize that if they cross these lines, they may get into trouble, and there is risk, and they could become a spectacle. And gadflies on social media may go after them, and they could attract the attention of a Trump or a Musk. And it's not even just over time, what we've seen in authoritarian societies. It's not just conscious acts of self-censorship where you think, well, I'd really like to write this article, but I'd better not. What happens over time is you don't even have the idea of writing the article. It just doesn't pop into your head because the incentive structure is such that it would pose risk. And so you retreat to safer terrain, and it just narrows the scope of public discourse. And when we talk about the topic today is the rule of law, and something that I've been increasingly thinking about, and I'm curious what how the others here look at it, is we're used to playing a particular game, all of us that kind of came of age in this country, with rules and norms and institutions and constitutional protections and safeguards and a balance of power. And this administration is not playing that game. They've tossed out the board. They're not playing by those rules. And I think we're already seeing in the courts that they are adapting. I think they're trying to avoid a head-to-head confrontation because they're really not prepared for that. We don't have a mechanism in this country to deal with that. And I think the prospect of it is very frightening for them. And I think they will do everything they can to probably back away from it. And so I think the question we face is, how do we fight back? And knowing that the rules we're used to playing by are no longer operative. And, do we have it within us to find a different playbook? It's not going to be easy because it goes against a lot of our instincts that are well honed for a reason. We're law-minded and rule-minded people, and that has made for a stable and orderly society. But I am not sure that those means and mechanisms are going to meet the moment. And I don't know what the alternative really looks like, but it's a question I find myself asking.
Thank you, Suzanne. I'd like Sean to reflect a bit on this moment in terms of other moments in American history, just briefly, and what you think in terms of how people should think about it and place it in time in comparison to what's happened before.
Yeah, this is completely unprecedented. There is nothing in American history that you can point to that amounts to basically the destruction of the American government from within, using the institutions of the American government basically to destroy it. The closest crisis was secession in 1860-61, but they seceded. They tried to secede. They didn't try to take over the government and destroy it from within, which is what's going on here. And listening actually to everyone, Deborah, Richard, and Suzanne, I mean, at the levels of law, at the level of ethics, the level of culture, this is a frontal assault on all of civil society. What we think of as it's an absolute bulwark of any democracy. It's not just what goes on inside government itself, it's the society outside of it. That's what Tocqueville talked about as the essence of democracy in any case. So what this is an attempt to either destroy it outright or simply to take it over. So that you'll see in this, there will be these museums, but it's not going to be telling anything close to the truth. It's going to be telling something like just a pack of government lies. There will be ethics rules, I suppose, but they're going to be very, very odd, and they're not going to be particularly ethical. And as for the law firms and so forth, I mean, look, they're plainly out to destroy what they think of as a bastion of possible resistance to what they're doing. That's what it's all about. The other point to be made, I think, and this is listening to you all, is that this is basically based on one thing and one thing only, and that is fear. And that goes to the basis, this goes to the whole topic of freedom from fear, which was one of the 4 freedoms that FDR indeed talked about. This is a shakedown government. This is a government that is engaged in saying to you, or if you're a university or a law firm, you've got a very nice place here. It would be a shame if anything happened to it. That is what Donald Trump is doing. It is thuggish. It is criminal. But it's right out of the, it's sort of a mixture really between, I don't know, John Gotti and Roy Cohn. That's the ethics that we're talking about here. But it's very effective. It's very effective. And you see it in every authoritarian regime that's ever existed in modern history. I mean, if you want to know something about what happened, say, at Paul Weiss, read Robert Paxton on Vichy France, and you'll understand what's happening. The crumbling, but it's all based on fear. And even the stock market, the whole bit. The tariffs are all about fear, right? That is the way he understands how to operate, how to rule, and that is what they're going to do. And it's going to change this country. It already has changed this country terribly, but it's going to change this country so that you won't even recognize it. And we're getting very, very close to that, actually. So, I mean, I joined with Suzanne at the end. I think we'd all agree. What do we do about it? That's the hard part. They have all the power, it seems, right now, but we're here. Civil society hasn't been completely undone. We are capable of doing what we're doing right now, and that's a start. I think that we can't. But in order to understand where we're getting started, we have to understand what we're up against. And we're up against something that is unprecedented. There's never been anything like it before in American history, and it's extremely dangerous.
Thank you, Sean. The issue you raise about the shakedown, not only, and this goes to Richard's area of ethics, not only have some senators and members of Congress asked for investigations into possible insider trading based on what Trump's announcement was the other day, that seemed pretty obvious. But he also said, in regards to the law, that he would be open to companies coming to him to make deals. And when asked how that would work, he said instinctively, that is not by the law. That's by the would-be dictator. We can have a number of questions if people wish to ask Q&A, and we already have one, and it is a question about the current crisis as a comprehensive failure of American institutions. The questioner says all three branches of government have failed, in his view. The media, which gives Trump free publicity and pays him bribes under the pretense of settling lawsuits, has failed. Business elites might be expected to oppose him purely in the interest of their own stock portfolios and companies, have failed. And even education has failed when we consider, according to the questioner, the worst monsters of MAGA graduated from Harvard and Yale. I see no one from Princeton there.
Yeah, no, we're not responsible, Deborah.
But Hegseth, in fact, graduated from Princeton, and was.
Yeah, I know, that's true. He was in my class. Well, never mind. We'll go on to that later.
And so there's a deeper corruption going on, and involving the norms of civil conduct that Suzanne raised. And how do we begin to repair that, given the comprehensiveness of this assault? And maybe, Deborah, you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. So I want to begin by agreeing entirely with Sean that this is unprecedented. He would know better than I, given his expertise in history, but it's certainly unprecedented, in the law, in the history of the United States. So I don't want to for a minute suggest that we are not in a very dire place, and one that I am occupied with constantly in my teaching and in my writing and in my work, and that we all should be. I do want to say, though, that I have a slightly, if not optimistic, amended take on how our institutions are doing. I think the legislature is failing, and the legislature has failed. And I think that's a failure that's been coming and been in evidence for some time. And we can talk about causes of that, the primary system or electoral systems or all kinds of things, polarization. But I think that's true. And I think we're seeing the sort of nadir of that in this administration. To the extent we're talking about government institutions, though, I think there's a very different story, both with respect to the courts and with respect to civil servants in the government. And it is not to say that they are 100% succeeding, or that either of those institutions or the combination of them is going to be remotely sufficient to actually stop what's happening now. That is the opposite of what I want to suggest. But I do want to suggest we are seeing and continue to see flashes of, and sometimes more than flashes of, real courage and conviction that set examples that I would like to see more Americans in all walks of life set, whether they are in industry or in media or in academia, where we have seen a sort of failure of courage in many sectors across the board. And it's the silence and the chilling effect that happened so quickly, the sort of compliance in advance that I think is one of the most disappointing things. The examples I mean, the courts, by and large, are behaving basically normally. Are the courts ever sufficient to stop authoritarian power? Is there going to be ultimately an enormous and already emerging compliance problems? Yes. But what the courts are doing is saying no repeatedly. There are some exceptions to that. There's sort of a large open question about the Supreme Court, but even the Supreme Court's decision that was so rightly criticized the other night, in which it said, no, we're not going to sustain what had been temporary restraining order on the president's use of the Alien Enemies Act, right, which has only been used 3 times before in American history, all enormous conflicts. But unanimously, at the same time, the court says, but there is simply no question that these people are entitled before their deportation to notice and an opportunity to be heard, to process about whether or not, in fact, the act applies to them, which was categorically not what happened in the first instance when they were ushered out in the still of night. And the court comes directly at the administration, all 9 justices, and especially the 4 in dissent, which include Amy Coney Barrett, who say mincing no terms, if the government does this again, they will be in outright defiance of an order of the Supreme Court of the United States. I don't know that I have ever heard or can recall a decision, either in a majority or a dissent, that was that much a direct confrontation with the President of the United States than the language we saw in that decision. That was what the great Chief Justice Marshall in Marbury versus Madison very carefully and painstakingly and ludicrously avoided, having to order a president to take some action that the president clearly didn't want to take. This Supreme Court, we are not going to win them all. And part of what Trump is doing is a long-standing sort of effort by the conservative legal movement to expand executive power. I think we'll see this court uphold some of that. But the courts are the opposite of rolling over. How this eventually plays out, I think, is an enormous open question. And again, just to reiterate, neither great lawyers and law firms who stand up against this administration, who deserve enormous credit, or university presidents like our own, who I'm enormously proud of, in President Eisgruber here at Princeton. But there are those examples, and they are in some respects leading examples, not sufficient, not remotely. Marches and protests are equally essential and will eventually, I suspect, I fear, be maybe more essential, but they are putting sand in the gears, slowing the roll of the race to an authoritarian ascension in a way that I think, and I can talk about civil servants as well in this success, but in a way that many other institutions are not. And I think if we fail to sort of identify what's working and give credit to what's working and get behind it, we will both lose hope, which is really the death of constitutional democracy. And we will lose the power of the examples to the extent they are being set. They're there for the seeking. And I think we can look for them and find power for all who want to retain constitutional democracy, and also find ways of devoting our energies to boosting them up.
Deborah, you raised the question of the failure of the Congress, the legislative branch. That goes to our theme of freedom from fear. They have been intimidated too. I wrote an article about a month ago in The Guardian about how the Senate, which initially had some members who were skeptical of Trump's nominees, particularly Pete Hegseth and some of the other more egregious ones, caved when they were threatened. They were threatened with a combination of Elon Musk's money and personal threats. And as a result of that, the Senate has become a submissive organ, and we know what the House is right now. But I wonder if Professor Painter has some comments on the role of the court going forward here.
Well, first of all, I do want to emphasize that it's pretty clear the intent of the framers was that Congress be the preeminent body in passing laws that the president would then execute. But that Congress really ought to be in charge in many ways, even though we have checks and balances between the three branches of government. And Congress simply isn't doing that, is failing in its role here. And it's very different than what we had in the Nixon administration, where I still remember being 11, 12 years old, watching the TV and the Republicans gradually figuring out that they had a crook in the White House. And then finally Barry Goldwater went over to the president, told him he had to resign or he'd get convicted in an impeachment trial. Congress isn't doing that now. That's very, very discouraging. Now we can talk about the Supreme Court. Now I'm not very popular with the justices, given my criticism of their ethics. And after I finish this book with the galleys on presidential power, I have to submit another book to Oxford on the ethics of the Supreme Court. Someone might say that's a very short book. This is a very troubling situation with the justices, and it blew up 2 years ago. We heard Clarence Thomas is on Harlan Crow's yacht, and Justice Alito flying on fishing trips with Paul Singer, the billionaire, and I mean, it went on. And the response of the court was, well, we get to make our own rules when it comes to ethics. Congress can't pass an ethics code. I mean, literally, Justice Alito said that. I was shocked because I helped prepare Justice Alito for his confirmation hearings when he was nominated by President Bush. And I could assure you he wasn't going to go in front of the United States Senate and say, well, the Senate can't, Congress can't pass a law restricting the ethics of Supreme Court justices and requiring some basic standards of ethics. We can't have a government where every branch does whatever it wants. The president must obey orders of the U.S. Supreme Court. And I know that extremists on the left and right have argued to the contrary, but that's been very clear since Marbury versus Madison. But the court does need to respect the statutes passed by Congress governing financial disclosure of the justices, and those rules were violated, as I'm going to point out this book coming out with Oxford. And it's very, very frustrating to hear the justices, some of the justices argue that separation of powers means that we get to do whatever we want. Well, then the president's going to say, well, then I get to do whatever I want, and I don't have to obey a U.S. Supreme Court order. And I think that's going to involve a very, very treacherous situation for a democracy. And that's completely contrary to the intent of the framers. What we're also dealing with is a growing oligarchy when we have this relationship between the business world and the political arena. This is exactly what Adam Smith rebelled against when he wrote Wealth of Nations, the mercantilism and the corruption of the parliament by the East India Company, the stock jobbing members of parliament, the South Sea Company. I gave a lecture on that back in 2006, and all the members of parliament trading in the stock while they were passing bills that would prop up the stock price. And it was, of course, a complete fraud and disaster. But that's the kind of thing that we wanted to rebel against. And we wanted a government that wasn't in the business of promoting certain companies that are friends with the president. And this idea that President Trump is going to negotiate with specific companies, specific deals. Well, I don't know whether he's negotiating for the Trump organization or for the presidency or the United States or both at the same time. That's not free market economics. And I'm no fan of completely unregulated free market economics either. That has its own pitfalls. But this idea of the government choosing the winners and losers and the political influence of billionaires in Washington, and the billionaires going to schmooze the president, like what I mentioned with Mark Zuckerberg. You put all this together, and it's extreme concentration of wealth and power in the same place. It's fundamentally un-American. Now, the upside here is I think that President Trump is going to have a tough battle if he wants to subdue the American economy, our universities, or our bar. Let's talk about the lawyers. He's going after the really big firms, but the vast majority of lawyers aren't in those firms and can continue to practice law, whether or not Donald Trump wants to issue an executive order, taking away their security clearances or whatever it is. We're going to have a lot of lawyers who are ready to fight. And even some of the larger law firms are ready to fight. The president has gone after some of the wealthiest universities, but by no means the best universities. We have wonderful state universities, flagship state universities in all 50 states. I spent 30 years of my career teaching at state universities. Is he going to go after every one of them and cut out everybody's funds? At some point, you're going to have people standing up to this president. It's going to be very hard in a country where we at least still have some diversity of economic power and many, many different universities and law firms and businesses to defeat everybody and make everybody become a vassal of the administration. And that's going to be our strength. And that's why, go back to concentration of power in the business. Well, while we have the antitrust laws, it's not just about economic efficiency. The reason we have antitrust laws is that if you have concentration of economic power in a few companies, few oil companies, a few railroads, they can corrupt the government, and you have an oligopoly that's running everything in the country. And it's going to be the same thing with universities. If you act like, well, there are a couple of universities that are the most prestigious, well, all he needs to do is take them over and put them all in a receivership, and he's running the country. Well, he's not. And the American people are not going to accept that. That's not the way we do business in this country. I think we need to stick to the rule of law, though. Absolutely critical. The rule of law is what makes a society work. And we're going to find very soon that this economy is going to blow up if the rule of law is not adhered to. If we have unregulated cryptocurrency, you got stock jobbing by members of Congress and the administration and whipsawing the stock market with these destructive tariffs. When the rule of law is not adhered to, things fall apart. Voters know that. And the worst thing that opponents of Donald Trump could do would be to buy into the notion that we shouldn't adhere to the rule of law. Law is independent of politics. And it was the famous Nazi jurisprudent, Carl Schmitt, who argued that law is just the concept of the political. The law is only about politics. There's no independent right and wrong. And he also wrote about the power of the executive, and the power of the executive to make exceptions to the law, because the executive represents the people. We know where that led in Germany. And I've seen Carl Schmitt cited with approval by the extreme left and extreme right in academia today. These are very dangerous ideas. There is objective truth. There is law. And when this government does not respect truth and law, we have to stand up to it.
Very eloquent, Richard. Suzanne, I wonder if you have some thoughts and about the whole cultural sector finding its voice in this crisis.
Yeah, I think it's a struggle. A theater director of a major theater was telling me that they were trying to get a letter of the theaters to push back against that NEA order that I mentioned, banning any material dealing with so-called gender ideology or DEI, and it was impossible. There were only 2 or 3 that were willing to sign the letter. It's like the law firms and the universities, but maybe more acute because these institutions are precarious. They're very much, they've suffered a lot during COVID. They still haven't recovered from that. They're reliant on donors, and I see right now a lot of chilling and retreat and fear. I saw something in this, not in the cultural sector, but that Wall Street analysts are censoring themselves to avoid pissing off the administration and becoming a target. I mean, talk about what's going to distort our economy and the respect that we hold globally. If the Wall Street analysts are no longer trusted, I think we're in new terrain. So I wish I was as optimistic as Professor Pearlstein, and it'll be interesting to see how things unfold in the coming months. We will find out whether, what she sees, these bright spots, and, I see them too. And I think there are judges who have stood up and taken risks, and, there are lawyers who've gone in and made forceful arguments, and there are TROs that have been issued. But, the things that worry me, why I have trouble feeling rosy about it, is I don't think any of us is sure to what degree these orders are being adhered to when it comes to the institutions that have had their funding withheld or been told to reinstate employees. It seems like there are a whole myriad of ways in which those orders are being evaded, and that we don't even know to what degree they're being adhered to. So that's one thing that worries me. The administration seems to be endlessly creative in coming up with new authorities to get done what they want to get done. If they need to go to the Congress on some of these things, at least in the next 20 months, I think they'll get the support of the Congress for a lot of what they're doing. And then when it comes to the Supreme Court, I just wonder when push comes to shove. I think that's where we really don't know. And maybe there's some positive signs, but there's also some really troubling signs. I mean, when is this man, if ever, going to be brought back from El Salvador, who the administration admits should never have been sent there? What a message of contempt from the White House podium and spokesperson to say that the judge should go and negotiate with the Salvadorian government herself. That's just the kind of thing we would never hear, that kind of contemptuousness, these efforts to get judges impeached. I'm sure we're going to see more physical attacks on judges. We're seeing them be attacked and impugned on social media. So, I hope you are right, and that we have reason to believe that this part of the system is going to help to save us. And I think you may be right. And I think it is gumming up the works. I agree with that, but I'm just not sure how long and how strongly it's going to hold.
Yeah. And I want to, if I can, right, I don't want to seem to suggest either that I'm optimistic or that I think these parts of the system are going to save us. They will not. Optimism is a very strong word. I would characterize myself as desperately worried, and more than I have been in my lifetime, about the fate of American democracy. What I do have is hope. And what I do see in these institutions not is saving, but as example setting. And example setting for whole swaths of both government officials and societal officials in all of these other sectors, right, that we are not seeing. And, from people who had been leaders and prominent, sort of commentators in public life who have sort of vanished in the current world. I'm not talking about politicians as such, but some of them included certainly artistic figures. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that, right? I think there are a lot of understandable reasons for that. There's actual fear, and I completely understand that. There's exhaustion. There's self-protection and the instinct to say, let me look after myself and family and not get caught up and have my entire world turned upside down by the outside world that's being turned upside down. And I completely get that, and I struggle with that as well. But I think telling the stories of how it is possible to resist within the law and in other, through protests and in many other ways, make it possible to build those forces, to relearn that muscle that we somehow seem to have forgotten either over generations or very quickly over the last few months.
This is fundamentally un-American, what's going on. And I think fact is Donald Trump got elected for a second time because the Democrats bungled the campaign and let Joe Biden hang in there too long. I mean, there was some support with American people for some of the Republican platform, but a lot of voters realized that Donald Trump's behavior was unacceptable the first time around. He's a sore loser. We all know what a sore loser is like. And I know that didn't determine the outcome of the election. But we're starting to see the Secretary of the Treasury joke about, well, people won't miss their Social Security checks or whoever it was. Well, that's going to hit hard when the economic effects of what's going on start to reach the American middle class. That's going to make a big difference. And they put this economy in the tank, which is what tariffs do. This type of trade war is going to do. It could be a political disaster for President Trump and anyone he supports. People may not care if he's going after Columbia or Harvard or places like that, most Americans don't think too highly of or don't even know much about. But if he starts going after all of our state universities and then funds are drying up for our public schools, our school teachers aren't getting paid, our police forces aren't getting paid because revenue sharing with the states gets cut by Doge. And the idea of Elon Musk destroying their entire federal government, people are going to feel the impact of that very, very quickly when you start considering what the middle class voters wanted from this government. Donald Trump sold a bad bill of goods. And he sold a bad bill of goods at a time when the Democrats were disorganized, were running a bad campaign, and President Biden held on to the office for too long. But that doesn't mean there's going to be support for this. And I think if we stick to what American values really are, and the respect for the rule of law that many Americans want from our politicians, and the concerns of middle-class voters, I don't think this is going to last very long. There's just not going to be support for it.
So we have one other question, and it has to do with something that Professor Pearlstein raised about a distinction between the rule of law and negotiation. And the questioner says that there are large commercial law firms like Paul Weiss and Wilkie Farr that rarely see the inside of a courtroom because most matters are settled by negotiation. So should we be surprised that they embrace the second type of regime when the president proposes it and threatens punishment if they don't? And I would raise a larger question, and I don't want to go on for a long time here because we have we're going to have to make some closing remarks. But Trump wants nothing but everybody to negotiate with him and to substitute that for the rule of law. And it's all based on his whim, as he said, instinctively, when it comes to all the companies. And that creates a pervasive sense of fear that extends throughout society, including in all the cultural institutions that Suzanne described, where people are trying to find their footing and haven't found their voice yet to actually creatively describe and express what's going on in an artistic way, which would be very helpful, as opposed to simply writing letters of protest, because the artist's real power is in art. But I pose that question about negotiation to you, Deborah, and then I'd like Sean to provide our closing remarks.
Great. So a couple of brief thoughts about that, right? There's nothing that's inconsistent between the rule of law and negotiation. Negotiation and all kinds of forms of dispute resolution are very much a part of every rule of law system, including ours. Nor is it surprising at all that law firms, which do that all the time, as do all lawyers, would seek to pursue that. But I want to make a distinction between negotiation and what's going on here, which is capitulation. Negotiation is typically a process that occurs, number one, within a legal framework, right? We're going to have, it also has a process attached to it, which all sides agree on and then follow. And typically, especially when you're talking about negotiation between two experienced and relatively powerful partners, right? It has a result in which there is winning to some extent on both sides, right? Both sides are promised something, both sides get something out of the deal, right? The executive orders that have been issued and the sort of promises or whatever they are that the firms have made have no bindingness attached to them at all, right? The firms, the president promises the firms nothing, and indeed the firms don't get out of the danger of, and indeed already we're seeing subsequent sort of threats or casual comments by the president that, oh, well, they're going to represent me for free if I ever leave the presidency and get into trouble with the law again, right? The firms think that what they are agreeing to is to provide pro bono legal support, in kind for causes that the president cares about. It's not remotely clear that that's certainly not what the president thinks he just got, nor is there any bindingness to the deal, right? So these are simply the firms saying, please don't shoot, right? And it is under pain of duress, that is the threat of losing their entire business and livelihood, that the negotiation is happening. It's very much what I think Sean was saying at the outset. This is not negotiation. This is extraction in a sort of mafia-like fashion, Sopranos-like style. That's not negotiation with the rule of law. That's something quite different. The one other thing to say there, though, and then I'll stop, is typically when there is a legal right, and especially a constitutional right, and several of them are implicated here, it's why the firms that are challenging these orders are winning quickly in court. They have a right to speak, and clients have a right to select the counsel that they want, and to have the counsel be able to represent them, not in fear of sanction from the government. In many respects, given the consequences for surrendering those rights in this case, they're not things that belong to the firm to be negotiated away, right? The First Amendment, right, doesn't belong to Paul Weiss. Neither does the Sixth Amendment right to counsel. And they may think that what they're doing is a sort of ordinary trying to stand up for their own interests, but what they're doing in effect is negotiating protections for the rule of law that belong to all of us, and not just to them. And that's part of why what they're doing is, I think, such a threat. So I'll stop there.
Sean, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah,
here?
some closing thoughts. Going back to something that Richard said, this is un-American, and it is un-American. And at another level, it's not. Because there's always been in our politics and in our history a very, very dark strain of politics. And I associate the Confederacy with it above all. That is based on the idea that all men are not created equal, that the rule of the proper rule of mankind is with force rather than with law, that it's about, these kinds of things. This has been a strain in our history going very far back. And American history has in large measure been a struggle against that force. that is also part of America, alas. But so far, we've been extremely lucky. So far, I mean, it's cost hundreds of thousands of lives, but we've managed to keep the upper hand against that dark strain. I think that dark strain is now showing itself rampant within the federal government. And those are the stakes, really, that we're up against. They are that large. They are that historic. And unless we, Abraham Lincoln gave a very important speech in February 1860 when he's running for president, or starting to run for president, in which he concluded with said, look, our opponents believe that might makes right. Well, we are here to say that no, right makes might. That's the essential problem we're up against. Whether it's a matter of being, a soprano-like figure, that's about might. Whether it's about, any of the other things that we're seeing this administration do, it's about might rather than about right. Might makes right. We have to stand up, as Abraham Lincoln did in 1860, and stand up for what we truly believe in, what is the highest of what American ideals are. And that is something very, very different. And I'll leave it at that for now. But we'll continue this conversation and continue this fight as long as we can.
Well, thank you, Sean, and especially for that reference to Lincoln's Cooper Union address, in which he spoke about not being afraid of anything from, as he put it, our enemies, and believing that right makes might. And I want to thank our panelists, Deborah Pearlstein, Richard Painter, Suzanne Nossel, and to all of those who've attended this and who will listen to this from our group, the Court of History. There will be future webinars, and we will call them to your attention. Thank you.
Welcome back. The depth of the quality of the information that we are bringing to you on Legal AF is unmatched anywhere else on YouTube. I'm not just bragging. I wasn't even on that panel. I'm just telling the truth. We've assembled for you, like a combination TED Talk meets a law school class, meets a YouTube seminar, but in an informational and educational and entertaining way. We do it like no other on the dial. So pleased to have Sean and Sidney here with us, and they're going to be doing regular work. They've already put out 5 or 6 videos. Go to Court of History, the highest court in the land, the highest court in the world, even above the United States Supreme Court, because we're all going to be judged by history. And which side of the bend and the arc of history are we going to be on? We know which ones we are here on Legal AF. Take a moment, hit the free subscribe button, and help us continue to bring amazing contributors like Sidney and Sean. Till my next report, whatever it may be, in all things Legal AF, I'm Michael Popak. Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.